Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. Today I want to talk about nib files. We're not going to spend a great deal of time with nib files, but in brief, they were the old way to set up user interfaces. They're still slightly preferable to using storyboards now in very large applications or in team environments where one developer is working with one set of view controllers and their views, and another developer is working with another set of view controllers, and so forth. However, we can also have multiple storyboards in an app, and there are ways to merge multiple storyboards into a single storyboard. So nib files are beginning to become a thing of the past. However, they're still there, so we're still going to talk about them briefly. Nib actually is short for Next Step Interface Builder. So what is Next Step? Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Interface Builder, however, is a component of Xcode that allows the construction of user interfaces. That makes sense, right? It's an interface builder. Next Step was an operating system developed on the Mach Unix kernel, and this was developed in the late 80s. Tim Berners-Lee actually used Next Step when he was writing the first web browsers. But it's a Unix-based system, and it had a C/ObjectiveC API, which made it fairly unusual for the time. ObjectiveC was in its infancy. We know ObjectiveC started out in the early 80s. This OS eventually kind of morphed into OpenStep, which of course eventually became OS X and iOS. But we still find traces of Next Step in the kernel, in the iOS and OS X Foundation classes. These are preceded by the letters NS, and NS stands for Next Step. So we've seen NS Object and NS String and NS Array. All of those actually are descendants of the original strings and arrays and Objective-C objects in Next Step. Nibs are actually XML files. So a nib file is an XML representation of a single user interface. If we're in Interface Builder, we can choose to view the nib file, the underlying nib file, as XML if we really want to do that. It is XML. When they're saved, they have a zib extension. This is pronounced either zib or nib, but it's an XML Interface Builder file, so it's XIB. Nib files, or zib files, are then compiled actually into view objects during the app startup process and attached to each view controller's .view property. So every view controller in our application has a view property, which is of type UIView. Its core type is UIView. And then if we use nib files and if we use storyboards, those views are compiled from the XML. This actually happens between the execution of application will finish launching with options and application did finish launching with options. So at design time, we're going to drag and drop controls onto a view using Interface Builder, and this will build our nib file. And then we want to assign files owner in Interface Builder to the view controller that we want to control this view. And then in that view controller's interface, we're going to create our IB outlet properties and IB action methods for the passive and active controls on the view. Then we go back into Interface Builder and we wire up these properties and methods in Interface Builder. And then we write code in the implementation file of the view controller to implement the action methods that we're going to fire when we press buttons or move sliders or do whatever we do. Now, the last three of these bullet points are the same, regardless of whether we're using nib files or storyboards. So when we move to storyboards here in the very next discussion, and for the rest of the course, we'll be talking about the same last three steps. Nib files do have some shortcomings. A nib file, first of all, can only represent a single view in an application, whereas a storyboard represents the entire view structure and the transitions and connections between those views. The nib for every view controller must be loaded in code. In some cases, this is done for us automatically, especially in older versions of Xcode. But now, and more importantly in other cases, the code has to be written by us. Storyboards, of course, overcome these drawbacks, but again, it may be advisable to use nib files starting with kind of an empty application template for some larger applications, or especially if you're using a distributed kind of a developer team, rather than trying to merge up a bunch of storyboards into one, or work with one piece of a storyboard at a time. Thank you very much.